We've all seen the victory feasts in movies. The roaring fires, the drinking horns, the warriors celebrating with gold piled high. But there's a story that begins after the flames burn low. One history rarely tells. It is the story of noble women, the queens, princesses, and daughters of chieftains whose halls had just been conquered. Their fate was not an afterthought, it was a strategy. For these women, defeat was not the end of war. It was the start of something darker. Some were paraded as trophies, some forced into marriages that erased bloodlines, others traded away like spoils. Each fate was designed to remind the conquered of their powerlessness. This is not a tale of romance or rescue. It is about humiliation, survival, and the silent cost of conquest. A history buried beneath the songs of Viking glory, but written in the scars of those who endured it. This is the unspoken fate of noble women after Viking conquests. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. And let us know in the comments, from which city are you hearing this story today? Before the flames and the screams, before the long ships pressed their black shapes against the shoreline, the noble halls of the north were filled with a different kind of sound. The rustle of woven gowns, the measured steps of servants across timber floors, the quiet rhythm of prayers spoken by women who believed their gods would always keep their homes safe. In the fortified halls of the chieftains and petty kings, noble women were raised with a sense of order. They were the symbols of bloodline and honor. Their marriages could forge alliances. Their presence at feasts could elevate a ruler's prestige, and their children would carry the legacy of clans forward. Within those wooden walls, beneath roofs heavy with smoke and carved beams that told the sagas of their ancestors, these women lived surrounded by ritual, duty, and expectation. They were not powerless. A queen could influence her husband's counsel. A daughter could be promised to secure peace between rival chiefs. A widow could control dowries and inheritance. Their authority, however, was fragile, built upon the survival of the men who defended their households. For all the beauty of their lives, there was always the shadow of war at the edge of their lands. The Viking Age was not a time of safety. Raids were as common as the changing seasons, and the strongest fortresses could fall within a single night. Noble women grew up with stories of fire and plunder whispered as warnings. Yet many still believed their lineage, their titles, their sacred oaths would shield them. But history would prove otherwise. When the dragon-proud ships came slicing across the sea, they did not distinguish between slave or queen, between peasant girl or princess. The conquest was absolute. The higher the status, the greater the humiliation. For a victorious warlord, a captured noblewoman was more than a woman. She was a statement. She embodied the fall of a rival, the proof that no bloodline was safe. And so even in their moments of peace, these women lived on the edge of silence, unaware that their lives could shift in a single heartbeat. One feast too many, one alliance broken, one night when the horns sounded at the shore instead of in the hall, and everything they knew would collapse. In the evenings when the warriors feasted, and the skalds recited tales of Odin's battles, the women's voices often faded into the background. Yet their presence was essential, a mark of civilization amid the brutality of the north. To the conquerors, however, they would be nothing more than spoils of war, stripped of their dignity and used as pawns in the endless game of power. This was the unspoken truth that lingered like smoke above the fires of every hall. The strength of a woman's lineage could not shield her when the longships came. Morning in the noble halls carried its own rhythm. The first light filtered through narrow windows, spilling across carved benches and the woven hangings that told stories of ancestors. Servants moved silently, stoking fires and preparing bread, while the noblewomen stirred within chambers heavy with furs. They awoke not as laborers, but as figures bound to ceremony. A queen might walk to the high seat where her husband had sat in judgment the night before. She would oversee the preparation of mead for guests, direct the servants in setting tables, and quietly manage the household's wealth, the keys to storerooms tied to her waist like silent symbols of power. Daughters of chieftains grew up in this order. Their world was one of learning, not books or scrolls, but the memorization of alliances, family feuds and obligations stretching back generations. They were trained to weave not only cloth but futures, their hands shaping destinies as surely as they shaped thread. Every marriage they entered would echo through time, securing peace or reigniting war. Yet beneath this order lay tension. Whispers in corridors often carried rumors of ships sighted far off, or rival chiefs who had broken oaths. Women learned to mask their fear, to continue their tasks as though the horizon did not hold danger. In feast halls, where warriors boasted of their raids, women served as both adornments and symbols of prestige. A nobleman's power could be measured not only by his victories, but by the women who sat at his side. Their jewelry, their silks, their presence spoke of wealth and influence. But to the enemies who eyed them from afar, these same symbols marked them as prizes waiting to be claimed. The songs of the skalds told of glory and conquest, but never of what followed for those left behind. Young girls listened to these sagas, their eyes wide, never realizing that one day they might become the silent verses, the parts of the story never sung aloud. On the surface, life seemed secure. The halls were strong, the warriors loyal, the gods surely watching over their chosen families. But history moves in silence before it strikes, and as the longships gathered far away, as axes were sharpened and shields prepared, the women in these halls walked unknowingly toward their fates. They prayed at shrines, they prepared for marriages, they celebrated births, never realizing that every joy carried the shadow of loss. The fate of noble women was not decided in their chambers, but on the waters, in the minds of men who saw conquest not only in terms of land and treasure, but in bloodlines and bodies. What appeared as order was in truth a fragile illusion. A single raid could shatter it, and when it did, the women would discover that their lineage, their titles, even their sacred roles offered no shield. They were living on borrowed time, beneath a sky that held storms no prayers could keep away. Seasons marked the rhythm of noble life. In summer, the air in the great halls carried the scent of pine smoke mixed with mead, and women oversaw preparations for journeys, marriages, and the storing of goods. In winter, snow pressed against the timbers, and within the hall the noble women lit lamps that glowed against the carvings of gods and heroes, reminders of divine strength. From the outside, their lives seemed secure. They wore cloaks lined with imported furs, necklaces of silver, rings that bore the weight of dynasties. They carried themselves with the confidence of women who believed that their lineage made them untouchable. To marry a noblewoman was to marry into power. To birth her children was to extend a family's claim to land and legacy. But even as they moved through this world of privilege, an unease lingered. The sea was never still. Rumors of distant raids drifted inland like smoke carried by wind. Each tale grew darker in the telling. Villages burned, men cut down, women dragged to ships in chains. Noble households reassured themselves that their walls were strong, their warriors loyal, their gods just. Yet in quiet moments, when the fires dimmed and laughter faded, the women felt the weight of fear pressing close. They had seen what happened to lesser households. A neighboring hall once filled with laughter, reduced to charred beams. A rival chieftain's daughter, married with ceremony one season, taken captive the next. These were warnings, but warnings they dared not voice aloud. To speak too openly of fear was to invite it, and so they remained silent, carrying their dread like a hidden wound. In the daylight, they played their roles, weaving tapestries that displayed family triumphs, instructing servants, preparing feasts. Their faces shone with dignity, but their eyes often flickered to the horizon, for they knew that no wealth, no alliance, no lineage was truly safe. The longships could come for anyone, and when they came not as rumor but as fire. The noble halls stood tall, but they were only wood. The warriors swore oaths, but they were only men. And for the women whose fates were bound to the fragile strength of both, life was a balance perched on the edge of ruin. The feasts would not last forever. The laughter of children in the courtyards, the songs of the skalds, the warmth of hearthfires, all could vanish in a single night. And when it did, these women would discover the cruel truth, that their place in history was not to be remembered for the power they once held, but for the suffering that would follow their defeat. Autumn was the season most feared in the noble halls. It was the time when ships returned from voyages, not always friendly, not always expected. The sea became crowded with sails, and the distinction between trader and raider blurred. For noble women, this meant every sound of horns in the distance could bring either relief or terror. In their private chambers, they tended to rituals that gave the illusion of control. They prayed at small altars, offered carved figures of wood or ivory, and whispered for protection over their children's cradles. These were not empty gestures. They were lifelines, fragile attempts to bind the fate of their families to divine mercy. Yet beneath each prayer lay the same unspoken thought: what if the gods are silent? Life within the hall continued in its cycle. Banquets filled the night, political alliances were negotiated across long tables, and noble daughters sat quietly beside their fathers, absorbing every gesture, every word, preparing for futures decided for them. The women wore brooches of amber and silver, hair braided with ribbons, their presence both ornament and symbol. To outsiders, they were the crown of the household, the visible proof of wealth and authority. But in the eyes of conquerors, such symbols became invitations. Her queen seated proudly on a high bench, a daughter walking through the hall with attendants. These were not untouchable figures. They were marks of victory waiting to be claimed. A noblewoman represented the fall of an entire lineage. Her capture could humiliate rivals more than burned halls or stolen treasure. There was a cruel irony in this reality. The very status that gave noblewomen influence within their halls made them greater targets when war came. Their beauty, their lineage, their refinement, all that had once elevated them above the common women, would condemn them to harsher fates. The higher they had been placed in the order of their world, the deeper they would be dragged in its destruction. Evenings in the hall glittered with song and feast, but outside in the darkness beyond the walls, there was always the sound of waves against the shore. For some, that rhythm was comforting, a lullaby of the sea. For others, it was a warning, a reminder that ships were always moving, that enemies were always watching, and that silence could shatter into violence without warning. The noble women sat in the glow of firelight, surrounded by luxury, but the ground beneath them was already shaking. Their world was not as permanent as it appeared. It was a structure of wood, not stone, of loyalty, not certainty, of titles, not guarantees. And though they carried themselves as though untouchable, history was preparing to strip that illusion away. The calmest moments often carried the heaviest weight. Noble women walked the courtyards, their cloaks trailing across stone paths, their hands brushing against carved railings that bore the stories of their ancestors. They moved as though the world would always remain in balance, yet their steps echoed with a tension that could not be ignored. For even in stillness, they knew their place in history was never secure. Children laughed in the training yards, young sons striking at wooden posts with toy swords, daughters practicing the weaving of bright patterns into cloth. These were the images of continuity, of families expecting to pass on wealth, land, and honor. Yet beyond the laughter lingered a darker truth. Every child, every promise of the future, was vulnerable to the sudden strike of raiders who recognized no innocence, no sanctity of youth or bloodline. Inside the halls, preparations for winter continued. Food was salted and stored, furs hung in storerooms, weapons cleaned and stacked. The noblewomen oversaw these efforts, their authority subtle but undeniable. They kept the order of the household steady, believing that discipline could shield them from chaos. But order was only as strong as the walls around them, and the walls were only timber. At night, as feasts roared and horns clashed in celebration, some women would pause and listen to the distant silence between songs, the silence of the sea restless beyond the horizon. In those moments, fear pressed harder than laughter. The firelight on their faces concealed the unease in their eyes, but deep within they knew, storms do not warn before they break. The nobility of the north lived on borrowed time. Every conquest that expanded one household meant ruin for another, and the wheel of fate never ceased turning. Today's queens could become tomorrow's captives. Today's princesses could wake tomorrow to fire and ash. What made their lives most fragile was not weakness, but visibility. They were symbols, living emblems of power. And when raiders came, it was not enough to kill warriors or take gold. To strip a household of its women was to strip it of dignity, to leave a scar that no rebuilding could erase. For these noble women, destiny was already moving toward them across the sea. The longships carved their paths through dark waters, their sails heavy with wind and intent. Oars struck the waves like drums, each stroke carrying men closer to the halls where women still lit candles and whispered prayers. And soon those prayers would meet silence. The doors of the halls would splinter, the timbers would shake, and the illusions of safety would collapse in a single night of fire and screams. Their world, built on lineage, power, and ceremony, was about to be tested in the most brutal way. And when it shattered, the noblewomen would discover that their true fate was not written in the halls they kept, but in the shadows of conquest waiting at their gates. The night of fire began like any other. The hearths inside the hall burned steady, the warriors boasted of their deeds, and noblewomen moved quietly among them, arranging cups of mead, speaking in low tones, observing the order that kept the household alive. Outside, the wind pressed against the wooden walls, carrying with it the restless sound of the sea. Then came the horns. At first they were mistaken for the echoes of festivity, but soon the truth was undeniable. The low guttural notes rolled over the waves, a sound no one within the hall could mistake. These were not the horns of celebration. They were the horns of war. Men sprang to their feet, overturning benches, snatching weapons from racks, shouting orders drowned in chaos. Children were hurried into corners, their mothers pulling cloaks over their heads as if cloth could hide them from fate. The noblewomen stood frozen, their carefully woven gowns suddenly weightless against the crushing dread that swept through the hall. When the doors splintered under the weight of axes, the world they had known ended. Warriors poured in, faces painted, shields pounding, swords glinting in the torchlight. The air filled with smoke and screams, with the bitter tang of blood. Husbands and fathers fought desperately, but the hall that had stood for generations was no fortress. Timber walls burned fast, and oaths of loyalty shattered beneath steel. The noblewomen watched as the men they had depended on fell one by one. The high seat was overturned, the carved beams blackened with soot, the songs of the skalds silenced forever. Some women tried to run, but the exits were blocked. Others clutched children to their breasts, whispering prayers even as rough hands tore them away. For queens, princesses, and daughters of chieftains, there was no mercy. Their lineage marked them for special humiliation. While common captives might be ignored or killed, noble women were seized with deliberate care. They were prizes, symbols, and weapons. The higher their birth, the greater their suffering. Dragged from their burning halls, they were bound with coarse rope, their gowns torn, their jewelry ripped away. The night air struck cold against skin once wrapped in silks. Behind them, their homes collapsed in flames. Ahead of them, the longships waited, black silhouettes against the firelit shore, ready to carry them away into darkness. The march to the shore was chaos. Smoke stung their eyes, ash clung to their hair, and the cries of the defeated echoed all around. Some women stumbled, their feet bleeding on frozen ground, their pleas ignored. Others were shoved forward, their dignity shattered with each step. The conquerors laughed as they herded them like cattle, their victory complete. The noble women were forced to witness the ruin of everything they had known. Warriors dragged treasures from the hall, silver goblets, woven tapestries, weapons etched with family crests. But greater than the loss of wealth was the sight of kin broken and scattered. Sons cut down, fathers humiliated, husbands left lifeless in pools of blood. Every memory of pride and safety was erased in a single night. The conquerors treated their captives not as human beings, but as possessions. Women who had once commanded servants now had no control over their own steps. A queen whose word had once carried weight now found herself shoved to the ground, her face pressed into the mud. A daughter once promised to a noble marriage was bound with rope that bit into her wrists, her future reduced to whatever use her captor chose. When they reached the longships, the women hesitated. The vessels loomed like monsters, their carved prows staring down with merciless eyes. But hesitation meant nothing. They were pushed aboard, their cries swallowed by the waves. On deck, the conquerors secured their trophies. Some women were forced beneath furs to shield them from the cold, not out of mercy, but to preserve them for later. Others were chained directly to benches, their tears mixing with sea spray as the oars dipped in unison. The rhythm of rowing began, and the shoreline of their homeland faded into darkness. The sea swallowed their cries. What had once been familiar waters now carried them further from hope with each passing stroke. The noble women huddled together, trembling not just from cold, but from the knowledge that their lives no longer belonged to themselves. They were no longer daughters, wives, or queens. They were spoils. Days at sea bled into one another. The women were given scraps of food, sometimes none at all. They endured the rolling waves, the stench of sweat and seawater, the harsh laughter of their captors. At night, when the sky stretched endless and black above them, they lay awake in terror, each one wondering what awaited at journey's end. Some ships carried them to markets, where noble women were displayed as proof of conquest, paraded before strangers who appraised them like goods. Others were taken directly to the halls of their conquerors, where their presence would humiliate defeated families and elevate the victor's pride. The cruelest part was not the physical suffering, but the erasure of identity. These were women born into power, raised with the certainty of lineage and duty. Now they were stripped of names and titles, reduced to symbols of loss. To their captors, they were living reminders that no bloodline, no matter how noble, could escape the reach of conquest. A queen once seated on a high bench now served as a concubine in her enemy's hall. A princess once destined for marriage alliances was forced to bear the children of her captor. Her womb turned into a tool of assimilation. Her daughter once praised for her purity, and Grace found herself treated as little more than currency, traded or discarded when she no longer pleased. Every noblewoman's suffering was unique, yet each fate carried the same message. Victory was not complete until the women of the defeated were broken. And so, in the rising action of their lives, the noble women discovered the true cost of conquest. It was not written only in fire and blood, but in humiliation, silence, and survival. Their voices faded, their titles forgotten, their dignity shattered. But their presence endured, as scars in history, as warnings, as unspoken stories buried beneath the songs of glory. The longships at last reached foreign shores. For the women who had once walked marbled halls or feasted under carved beams, the sight of strange coasts felt like the edge of the world. Their own lands lay far behind them, swallowed by waves and fire, leaving only the hollow ache of exile. They were herded from the ships like spoils of war, stumbling onto beaches where crowds gathered to see them. Men cheered, women whispered, children pointed. It was not curiosity but cruelty. A display meant to remind everyone that victory had been complete. The noble women, once radiant figures draped in velvet, now appeared as shadows of themselves. Their gowns were torn, their hair matted with salt and ash, their faces streaked with tears. Yet in their very brokenness lay the power their captors desired. They embodied conquest. Some were paraded through markets, displayed like treasures alongside silver and weapons. Buyers debated not their worth as humans but as symbols. A queen who could humiliate her husband's legacy. A daughter whose womb could be forced into new alliances. A princess whose presence alone would boast of triumph. The air stank of barter and degradation. Others were taken directly into the halls of their captors. There the contrast was unbearable. Once they had been hostesses of banquets. Now they poured wine for strangers. Once they had been addressed with titles. Now they were ordered about as servants. Their names, carefully recorded in lineages, were forgotten, replaced by mocking nicknames or silence. The conquerors understood what they were doing. To take a noble woman was to take her lineage, to smother the memory of her people, to claim victory not just over land, but over blood. Her body became a battlefield, as cruel as any fought with swords. And so, day by day, the noble women were stripped, not only of their dignity, but of their very identities. Among the captives, each woman carried her own private torment. A queen remembered her husband's last stand in the burning hall, the way his blood spread across the floor as she was dragged away. Every day in captivity replayed that image, and every humiliation was a reminder that his death had not saved her. A princess once courted with songs now endured silence. Where once her steps echoed in grand corridors, now she moved like a ghost in kitchens, fetching water for the very men who had slaughtered her kin. When she caught glimpses of herself in polished bronze, she scarcely recognized the hollow eyes staring back. Some daughters of chieftains were forced into marriages, not unions of choice but shackles of politics. The conquerors dressed it as alliance, but it was nothing more than the continuation of conquest by another means. Their children would bear the blood of the vanquished and the victor, a lineage meant to erase the old world. Others were kept as concubines, hidden behind walls where their suffering could not mar the laughter of feasts. To them, the silence of forgotten chambers was more suffocating than chains. They lived, but their voices were gone, buried beneath the weight of shame. What made their torment unbearable was not only what was taken, but what was remembered. They carried within them the memory of power, of halls filled with songs, of families united by pride. These memories were daggers that cut deeper than the ropes on their wrists. The noble women endured not only the loss of freedom, but the crushing knowledge that their downfall was spectacle. Their humiliation was not private. It was performance, designed to echo through generations. Seasons passed, and with them hope thinned. At first, some women clung to the thought of rescue. Surely, they told themselves, surviving kin would gather strength, allies would rise, warriors would come. But the years taught them otherwise. No banners appeared on the horizon. No horns of rescue sounded. The halls of their captors grew louder with celebrations, while the memory of their own faded like smoke. The noblewomen were forced to adapt. Some numbed themselves, performing tasks with empty eyes. Others built fragile alliances among fellow captives, sharing whispered memories of home as if to keep their old world alive. A few tried to resist, only to be beaten into silence. Survival became their only strategy. Children were born into this shadowed existence. Children who carried both bloodlines, living symbols of conquest. For the mothers, each birth was both agony and contradiction. They saw their own lineage diluted, their heritage claimed by another name. These children would never know the halls of their ancestors, never hear the songs that once honored their families. Their very existence was proof that the conquerors had won. Through it all, the noblewomen became living ghosts. Their bodies moved through kitchens, chambers, and markets, but their spirits hovered in the ashes of their old lives. Yet even in their silence, they carried a dangerous truth. That victory songs hid crimes, that glory was built upon suffering. Their very survival was a reminder, though unspoken, that conquest was not complete without cruelty. By the time years had passed, few remembered them as queens or princesses. The world moved on, new wars rose, new victories were celebrated. The noblewomen became footnotes in songs that praised their conquerors. But history has a way of carrying shadows. Whispers endured, of the queen who served in silence, of the princess whose eyes never lost their fire, of the daughters whose children bore names not their own. They were not honored in sagas, but their suffering shaped the very halls their captors built. For conquest was never just about land or gold. It was about domination of the spirit, about ensuring that the defeated could not rise again. The noblewomen embodied this final act of war. Their humiliation was as calculated as any battle strategy. And so, as the rising action of their fate reached its peak, the truth was clear. Defeat did not end with the clash of swords. It lingered in bodies broken, in names erased, in women silenced. The cheering had long stopped, but the price of defeat was still being paid. The story now pressed toward its climax, the point where suffering could no longer be ignored, where silence itself became a scream echoing through history. The years of captivity reached their cruelest point when the noblewomen realized there would be no rescue, no return, no restoration of the halls they once ruled. The songs of their people had died out, replaced by laughter in foreign tongues. Queens who once commanded armies now washed garments in cold streams. Princesses once promised to great alliances now sat in corners of feasting halls, ignored except when summoned. Daughters of chieftains bore children who did not carry their fathers' names, but the names of their captors. Their voices were gone, yet their silence was louder than any battle cry. Every bowed head was a reminder that conquest was not only about victory in the field, but about erasing memory, rewriting bloodlines, and turning once noble lives into tools of humiliation. The true climax of their story was not a single act of violence, but the slow, relentless realization that they had become living trophies. Proof that the conquerors had not just won the war, but had unmade entire families, kingdoms, and lineages. And in this moment of despair, history itself looked away. Their suffering became invisible, buried beneath sagas that sang only of glory. The halls still echoed with laughter, but the women within them moved like shadows, nameless, broken, yet unforgotten by the scars they left behind. When the songs of conquest were finally written, they celebrated only the warriors, the raids, the burning halls, the treasures carried home. The fate of the noblewomen was left in silence. Their lives, their suffering, were buried beneath the noise of glory. Yet history is not only told in victories. It is also written in absences, the missing names in family lines, the erased voices, the children who never knew their true heritage. The women who were taken did not leave behind monuments or sagas, but their scars shaped the world just as much as any battle. They remind us that conquest was never just about swords and shields. It was about breaking people, erasing memory and turning power into submission. The noblewomen carried this burden in silence, their pain unseen, their dignity stolen. And so the real question lingers: how many stories of conquest do we celebrate, without ever asking whose suffering was silenced to make them possible?